There are words you learned before you understood them. Sounds that arranged themselves in your mouth long before you questioned what they meant. Jack and Jill is one of those rhymes. You probably sang it as a child. You may have sung it to children since. And if someone asked you what it was about, you'd likely say, 2 kids, a hill, a bucket of water, and a fall. Simple enough, but perhaps not simple at all. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. The version most of us know continues. Up Jack got and home did trot, as fast as he could caper. He went to bed to mend his head with vinegar and brown paper. It's cheerful in the way nursery rhymes often are. Rhythmic, easy to remember, almost musical. Children recite it in schoolyards. Parents use it to teach rhyme and rhythm. It has the feel of something innocent, something that has always been harmless. And yet, if you pause for a moment and consider what the rhyme actually describes, something begins to feel wrong. 2 children climb a hill to fetch water. This alone is strange. Water flows downward. Wells are dug in low places where groundwater collects. Springs emerge at the base of slopes, not at their peaks. Why would anyone climb a hill to find water? The question has no easy answer. Then there is the fall itself. Jack doesn't simply trip or stumble. He breaks his crown. In older English, crown could mean the top of the head, but the word carries weight. It suggests something more than a scraped knee or a minor tumble. It implies fracture, breakage, something violent enough to require treatment. And the treatment is strange too. Vinegar and brown paper. Not a bandage, not a poultice of herbs. Vinegar, a substance sharp and astringent, and brown paper. Something crude and makeshift. This is not the care you would expect for a child's injury. It feels improvised, desperate, or perhaps ritualistic in a way we no longer recognize. Then there is Jill. She doesn't help Jack. She doesn't call for aid. She simply tumbles after him, as though her fall was inevitable, as though it had to follow his. The rhyme ends there in most versions, though some add another verse about Jill being whipped for laughing at Jack's misfortune. But even without that addition, the story feels incomplete. There is no resolution, no lesson. No clear reason why this particular accident among all the accidents children might have become something people remembered. And they did remember. Jack and Jill has been sung for at least 250 years, possibly longer. It appears in print as early as the late 18th century, but the language and structure suggest it's older still. It survived the shift from oral tradition to written record. It crossed oceans and borders. It outlasted empires and wars and the forgetting of countless other rhymes. Why? What is it about 2 children, a hill, and a fall that demanded to be retold? The rhyme doesn't explain itself. It doesn't announce its origins or justify its survival. It simply repeats, generation after generation, in the mouths of children who don't yet know how to ask why. But the strangeness remains. The water at the top of the hill, the broken crown, the tumbling that had to happen, the vinegar and the paper, and the sense that something important has been lost in translation. Perhaps what we call a nursery rhyme was once something else entirely. Perhaps the simplicity we hear is not the rhyme's original form, but what remains after centuries of forgetting. Stories change when they're passed down. They lose context, they shed meaning, but they don't always lose their shape. And the shape of Jack and Jill, the climb, the fall, the breaking, the following feels too deliberate to be accidental. It feels like a pattern, like a structure that once held something we no longer see. The rhyme doesn't tell us what that something was, but it asks us to remember that it existed, and that, perhaps, is why it survives. Not because it's cheerful or simple or easy to sing, but because somewhere in its rhythm and its strangeness, there's an echo of something much older, something that once mattered enough to be preserved, even if only in fragments, even if only in the form of 2 children climbing a hill that makes no sense, fetching water that shouldn't be there, and falling in a way that feels less like accident and more like inevitability. The rhyme we think we know may not be the rhyme at all. It may be the shadow of something we've forgotten how to see. The rhyme is not alone. If you look beyond the English nursery tradition, beyond the printed collections and the playground songs, you begin to find patterns, similar stories, similar names, similar structures involving water, height, and falling. The pattern appears too often to be coincidence. In Old Norse mythology, recorded in the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, there is a story about the moon. The moon, it was said, took 2 children from the earth to serve him. Their names were Hjúki and Bil. They had been sent by their father to a well called Bergir to draw water using a pole and a bucket. The moon saw them at their task and took them into the sky, where they remain, circling endlessly with their pail. Hjúki and Bil, Jack and Jill. The names are not identical, but the resemblance is difficult to ignore. Hjúki may have evolved into Jack through centuries of linguistic drift. Bil may have softened into Jill. The transformation is not implausible. Languages change, sounds smooth into easier forms, and stories carried orally across generations often preserve structure while altering surface details. What remains constant is the core image. Two figures, a vessel for water, and an association with height and celestial movement. Some folklorists believe this is no accident. They suggest that the English rhyme may be a distant echo of the Norse myth, surviving in fragmented form long after the original cosmology was forgotten. The Scandinavian influence on England was profound, particularly during the Viking Age. Words, beliefs, and stories crossed the North Sea and took root in English soil. It's possible that the tale of Hjúki and Bil came with them, transformed over time into something simpler, smaller, more suited to children. But the pattern extends further still. Water-bearers appear throughout Indo-European mythology. In Greek tradition, the constellation Aquarius represents a figure pouring water from the heavens. In Vedic texts, there are stories of celestial vessels and cosmic waters that sustain the universe. The act of drawing water from a well or spring often carried sacred significance. It was a ritual task, one that connected the earth to forces below or above. And the falling motif appears again and again. In many mythologies, ascent is followed by descent. Gods rise and then fall. Seasons turn from light to dark. The moon waxes and wanes. The cosmos itself was understood as cyclical, a constant movement between height and depth, fullness and emptiness. Jack and Jill go up the hill. They reach a high place, and then they fall. It's the same pattern. What may have once been a story about lunar cycles or seasonal change, an explanation for why the moon appears to grow full and then diminish, or why water seems abundant and then scarce, could have gradually lost its cosmic context. The myth became a tale. The tale became a rhyme. But the structure remained. In medieval Europe, similar stories circulated in different forms. There are folk tales about children sent to fetch water who encounter supernatural forces. There are ballads about lovers who climb hills and meet tragedy. The details shift, but the narrative architecture stays recognizable. A journey upward, a task involving water, and a fall that feels fated rather than accidental. The rhyme we know as Jack and Jill may be one branch of a much older tree, a tree whose roots reach back into pre-Christian belief systems, where the movements of the sky were not abstract science but living narrative, where the moon wasn't just a celestial body but a presence with agency, capable of taking children, of marking time, of influencing water and tides, and the rhythms of life on Earth. In that older understanding, the story of two children fetching water and falling might not have been about children at all. It might have been about the moon's phases, about the way light climbs toward fullness and then tumbles back into darkness, about the way water rises as vapor and falls as rain, endlessly cycling between earth and sky. The names changed, the setting simplified, the cosmic scale shrank into something a child could memorize, but the pattern endured, and that persistence suggests something important. Stories this old don't survive by accident. They survive because they once served a function. They helped people understand the world. They encoded observations about nature, time, and change into forms that could be remembered and passed along. Jack and Jill is not an isolated nursery rhyme invented by an imaginative poet. It appears to be part of a much wider tradition, one that stretches across Northern Europe, one that connects to ancient cosmologies and seasonal rituals, one that preserved knowledge in the only way available before writing became common, through story, through song, through rhythm and repetition. The hill they climb may not be a hill at all. It may be the arc of the moon's rise. The water they fetch may be the life-giving rains that depend on celestial cycles. And their fall, inevitable, paired, unchangeable, may reflect an ancient understanding that all things rise only to descend again. The rhyme doesn't tell us this directly, but the echoes are there, layered beneath the surface, waiting to be heard by those who know how to listen. What we sing to children may once have been sung to explain the heavens. A crown is not just a head. In older language, yes, the word could mean the top of the skull. But words carry more than their literal definitions. They carry associations, weight, history, and crown has always meant something beyond anatomy. It means sovereignty, authority, the sacred right to rule. When Jack breaks his crown, the rhyme uses a word heavy with meaning. And in the context of ancient belief systems, systems that understood kingship not as political office but as cosmic responsibility, a broken crown was not a minor injury, it was catastrophe. Across Indo-European cultures, kingship was bound to the land itself. The health of the king reflected the health of the fields, the livestock, the people. A strong king meant abundant harvests. A weak or wounded king meant drought, famine, failure. This belief appears in Celtic tradition, in Norse sagas, in Greek myth, and in the folklore of medieval Europe. The king was not merely a leader, he was a living symbol of cosmic order, and when that order fractured, it had to be restored. Some scholars believe that ancient cultures practiced ritual regicide, the deliberate killing or sacrifice of kings whose power had waned. The old king would fall, and a new one would rise, ensuring that the land remained fertile and the seasons continued their cycle. Whether this practice was literal or symbolic remains debated, but the stories survive. The fisher king wounded and unable to heal. The dying god who must descend into darkness before renewal can come. Jack falls, his crown breaks. And in the language of myth, this is not accident, it is necessity. The hill itself carries meaning. High places were sacred across ancient Europe. Hills and mountaintops were where offerings were made, where priests performed divination, where the boundary between earth and sky grew thin. To climb a hill was to approach the realm of gods or ancestors. To fetch water from such a place suggests a ritual act drawing from a sacred source, carrying something precious down from a height. Water was never merely water in these traditions. It was life, purification, renewal. Wells and springs were often considered portals to the underworld or dwelling places of spirits. Fetching water from a hilltop could represent the retrieval of sacred knowledge or divine blessing, something essential for the community's survival. But the retrieval fails. Jack climbs. Jack falls. The crown breaks. This is the structure of initiation rites found throughout the ancient world. The young are separated from the community. They undergo ordeals, physical trials, symbolic deaths, journeys into dangerous or liminal spaces. They are broken down so they can be rebuilt. The old self must die for the new self to emerge. Jill tumbles after, not as an accident, but as part of the pattern. In many rituals, pairs are significant. Male and female, light and dark, life and death. The pairing suggests balance, duality, the necessity of both forces moving together through the cycle. The healing that follows is strange but not arbitrary. Vinegar and brown paper. Vinegar was used in ancient medicine, yes, but it was also a substance associated with preservation and purification. Brown paper, rough and unrefined, might represent a return to simplicity, to the raw materials of the earth. The treatment is makeshift, but perhaps deliberately so symbolic rather than practical, marking the completion of a ritual rather than the mending of an actual wound. What the rhyme describes, beneath its simple surface, may be the echo of a seasonal ceremony, a reenactment of cosmic death and rebirth performed at specific times of the year to ensure the land's fertility. The participants, perhaps young people undergoing initiation, perhaps symbolic representatives of the community, would climb to a sacred site, perform the ritual actions, and return transformed. The story was repeated not because it was entertaining, but because it mattered. It encoded the structure of the ritual so that future generations would remember how it was done. When literacy was rare and knowledge was passed orally, stories served as mnemonic devices. The rhythm, the rhyme, the striking imagery, all designed to make the pattern unforgettable. To the people who first told this story, the broken crown was not a child's injury. It was the necessary wound that allowed renewal. The fall was not a tragedy. It was the descent that precedes every return. The water was not a simple household task. It was the sacred substance that connected heaven and earth. These meanings were coherent to them, emotionally real, woven into the fabric of their understanding of how the world worked. And when those belief systems faded, when Christianity replaced older gods, when rituals were forgotten or suppressed, when the reasoning behind the ceremonies dissolved into the past, the stories remained, stripped of context, reduced to fragments, but still recognizable, still repeated. The rhyme became a game. The ritual became a song. But the structure endured, carrying forward the shape of something sacred long after the sacredness itself had been forgotten. Jack and Jill may once have been more than names. They may have been roles, positions in a ceremony, representations of forces larger than themselves. The hill was a temple, the water was blessing, the fall was sacrifice, the healing was rebirth. And the rhyme that survives is what remains when all of that has been worn away by time, leaving only the pattern, only the echo. only the skeleton of something that once held an entire community's understanding of life, death, and the turning of the seasons. What we sing may be the memory of what we once believed. Even if we no longer remember believing it, memory is a strange thing. It forgets almost everything. Names, faces, entire languages disappear within a few generations. Empires collapse and leave barely a trace. Beliefs that once shaped entire civilizations fade into footnotes, then into silence, and yet sometimes a few words survive. A rhyme, a melody, a fragment of story that refuses to die. Hjúki and Bil is one of those fragments. We've traced it back through time, from the nursery rhyme we know, through medieval European folklore, into Norse mythology and the ancient cosmologies that understood the moon as a living presence. We've explored what it might have meant to people who saw the world differently than we do, who encoded their understanding of seasons and sovereignty and sacred cycles into stories they could remember. But the question remains, why this story? Thousands of rhymes were sung, thousands of rituals were performed, countless tales were told around fires and passed from one generation to the next. Most of them are gone now, lost completely. Not even fragments remain. Yet Hjúki and Bil endured. There's something in its structure that refuses to let go. The simplicity, perhaps. The rhythm that makes it easy to remember. The strangeness that makes it hard to forget. Children sing it without understanding it. Parents teach it without knowing its origins. And in that repetition, mindless, automatic, across centuries, the pattern survives. This is how human memory works when it operates below the level of conscious thought. We don't preserve things by trying to preserve them. We preserve them by using them, by singing them, by passing them along, not because we understand their importance, but because they feel right somehow, because the rhythm fits our mouths, because the story, however simple, carries a weight we can sense even if we can't explain it. The rhyme became a children's game precisely because it lost its sacred context. Once the ritual meaning faded, once the cosmological framework collapsed, the story was free to drift into new territory. It became entertainment, education, a way to teach rhyme and rhythm to young children, but the bones of the old meaning remained. The ascent, the water, the fall, the broken crown, the paired descent, the crude healing, all of it still there, still intact, even though the people singing it no longer know what it meant or why it mattered. This transformation happens more often than we realize. Lullabies often contain references to death, danger, and loss themes that seem inappropriate for soothing children to sleep until you remember that those songs were born in times when death was close, when infant mortality was common, when parents sang their fears into rhythm to make them bearable. Ring Around the Rosie may echo memories of plague. London Bridge is Falling Down may preserve fragments of foundation sacrifice rituals. Humpty Dumpty may refer to political upheaval or military defeat. We don't know for certain. We may never know. But the songs survive because they work as songs, regardless of what they once meant. The meaning can die while the form lives on, and sometimes, perhaps more often than we're comfortable admitting, what we think of as innocent entertainment is actually something much older, wearing a mask of simplicity. The people who first sang about Hjúki and Bil understood something we've forgotten. They understood that stories serve purposes beyond entertainment, that rhythm and repetition can preserve knowledge across generations, that what gets encoded into song has a better chance of surviving than what gets written down, because songs don't need literacy, don't need books, don't need anything except human voices and human memory. And so they sang about the moon and the children it took, about the king whose crown must break so the land can renew, about water and height and falling and the endless cycle of ascent and descent that governs everything from seasons to sovereignty. They sang it until it became part of the culture's bloodstream, until it no longer needed explanation, until it simply was. And then, slowly, they forgot why they were singing it, but they kept singing. That's the mystery, really. Not where the rhyme came from, but why it refuses to disappear. What is it about these particular words, this particular pattern, that has allowed it to survive the collapse of empires, the extinction of belief systems, the transformation of entire worldviews? Perhaps there's no single answer. Perhaps survival is partly accident, the right story in the right place at the right time, catching hold in the cultural memory just firmly enough to be carried forward. Or perhaps there's something in the structure itself that resonates with something deep in human experience. The climb and the fall, the breaking and the healing, the sense that what goes up must come down, and that this cycle, however painful, is somehow necessary. We still understand that, even if we don't believe in sacrificial kings or lunar deities, we still live in a world of cycles, Seasons still turn, things still rise and fall, and perhaps that underlying truth is what keeps the rhyme alive, not its specific mythological content, but the pattern it preserves, which remains true even when the explanations change. Jack and Jill went up the hill. We sing it to children without thinking. A few words, a simple melody, nothing remarkable. And yet beneath those words, layered like sediment, are centuries of human belief, ritual, and meaning. Fragments of cosmology, echoes of ceremony, the distant memory of a time when stories did more than entertain, they explained. They preserved. They connected the living to the dead and the earth to the sky. The rhyme we know is not the whole story. It may not even be a fraction of it, but it's what remains. And in a world where so much has been forgotten, where entire civilizations leave barely a trace, the fact that anything survives at all feels like a kind of miracle. Perhaps what we sing to children has always been older and stranger than we know. Perhaps the simplest rhymes carry the heaviest memory. And perhaps, in some way we can't quite articulate, we sense that weight when we sing them. We feel the presence of something beneath the surface, something that matters in a way we can no longer name. The story has forgotten itself, but it remembers that it should be remembered, and so we sing.